we are going to be continuing our study of learning about Latin America. We're going to talk about the history of Latinos and the refugees. So go ahead and get a notebook and a piece of paper and a pencil. Make sure you have Latinos and Latino immigration and refugees written at the top of your paper. And your name and the date, because I'm going to be collecting these after class today so you can get full credit. I'll look at Latinos in history. We're going to start off with what Vicky Ruiz, she's a Chicano scholar and historian. This is what she has to say. Many people have this popular vision of Latinos as people who arrived the day before yesterday. But when you think about the first European settlement in what would become the United States, it's in St. Augustine in 1565. That actually predates Jamestown in 1607 to almost 40 years. The first European language spoken in what would become the United States was actually Spanish. A lot of us did not know that. I know I was one that did not know that. And just to give you a little bit of history about Vicky Ruiz, she is noted as writing numerous books and stories. One of great notice is the Latinas in the United States. That's actually a historical encyclopedia. It's over 800 pages of different Latina voices. So it's actually one of the first of its kind. And that'll be on the test, so make sure you're writing that down. The Vaqueras, and I'm probably totally saying that wrong, Vaqueras are the same as cowgirls. They're early, with only 3% of California's Spanish Mexican population could be considered rancheros in 1850. Most women did not preside over large estates, but would help manage small family farms. In addition to traditional female tasks, Mexican women were accomplished cowgirls. Women were responsible for an array of strenuous chores. One can only imagine a young girl being serenaded in the evening and then awakening at dawn to slop the hogs. And that's from an excerpt out of Vicky's book. So, the famous Latino and Latina voices. These four names are just a small history of the rich, a small sample of the rich history that we are going to learn about today. And I know I'm saying the names wrong. So the first one is Apollinaria Laureana, and then we have Captain Nepomuceno Seguin, Mariano Vallejo, and Carlos Juan Finlay. So let's go ahead and talk about Apollino Lorenzia. She was born in 1790 and died in 1884. When Apollorina was 7 years old and an orphan, when she was 7 years old and she was an orphan, she was sent to the Spanish colonial government of Mexico to help populate to the farthest reaches of its American empire. Apollinaria has said that when the group of 22 orphan girls reached the capital of Monterrey, the government gave them all away like they were little puppies to the local residents. All of the orphans were given the last name Lorenzia because that was the name of the bishop that had brought them in to give them away. By the time that she had settled in Monterrey, the Spanish had dominated the New World for over 3 centuries. By 1808, Apollinaria had reached her teenage years and brought to Mission San Diego. It was the first mission founded by Spanish priests. As a young child in Mexico, she was taught to read. However, she had always wanted to learn to write. When she was a young girl, she actually taught herself by copying letters from different books. She would practice on any piece of paper she could find, even old cigarette wrappings, because back in that day when they had cigarettes, they actually had little pieces of paper and wrapped them up. She was largely responsible of a school owned by a California widows, where children were taught various skills such as reading, writing, cooking, and sewing. She never married and was a godparent to numerous other children. Let's see here. We'll kind of just something. I'm not going to read the whole thing on this one, but something to think about is that Apollinaria was a trusted woman by many in her community. The ship traders, priests, and local people trusted her judgment with buying and selling from ships that came into the bay. She has been a witness to some harsh treatment of the Indian women. She is noted as saying that she felt helpless when the servants were being punished, yet her place in society at the time was one of loyalty among the priests at the missions. So back in this day, when women didn't actually really have a voice, a lot of the different captains and traders really respected and trusted her, which says a lot about her character. Now this is Captain Juan Nepomuceno. He was born in San Antonio and married the daughter of one of the area's wealthiest ranching families. They had 10 children. He was a strong supporter of the Federalist principles. He was a thoughtful and literate man. He served his country in a number of political roles, including congressman and senator. And as the mayor of San Antonio, he served that for 2 consecutive terms. He fled his beloved homeland for Mexico, where he tried to build a new life for his family. During the Mexican War, he was forced by the Mexican government to take up arms against the United States, and he returned to Texas as soon as possible, where he continued his political service. He died in Laredo in 1890. His remains were returned to Texas in 1974 and buried at Seguin, the town named in his honor. Then we have Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo. He is said if he was not actually the founder of California's diversity, Vallejo was certainly one of its chief architects. A few interesting side notes about this very rich family. Francesca, who was his wife, was said to have 2 servants just for her, and each of their children had their own servant. 6 or 7 servants in the kitchen, and 5 to 6 just for washing their clothes. Most of the servants were part of the over 10,000 Indians that were now bound to a few dozen California families. They were a very well-to-do family who tried to practice the English ways of life. At dawn of the 14th of June, 1846, they were awakened by an armed mob at the Casa Grande in Sonoma Plaza. In his parlor, a group of Americans were waiting for him, a group like he had never seen before. He recalls asking what the trouble was and who was in charge. He asked them to what happy circumstance were they here for. He was said to be a very friendly person to all he met and welcomed him into their home and offered them drinks. They were not a friendly bunch, and they were trappers and pioneers who had crossed the Rockies and the Sierras and had laid claim to the Sacramento Valley. Organized by U.S. Captain John C. Fremont, they called themselves the Black Flag Revolt. They had come to arrest him and declare California an independent republic. Vallejo had long thought it was Mexico that stood in the way of progress, when in reality he felt he had learned that it was actually the United States that had turned on him after gaining his loyalty. While Vallejo was in prison, so they ended up putting him in prison, at Sutter's Fort on the Sacramento River under the command of Captain Fremont, Vallejo has a turning point with his sense of who he was, and he starts to have a different idea of who he thinks the Americans were. He starts to really question his life up to that point. 1 month into his imprisonment, he is hit with malaria. Vallejo learns that the United States and Mexico were at war. What would this mean to you or your family if you were in Vallejo's place? What are some of the feelings and thoughts that you would have? What about if you were his son or daughter and home with your mother? What are some of the feelings you would have towards Americans or Mexicans at that point? He had always taught his children to love America and to love Mexico. And then he found out that the country that he was fighting for had turned on him. So it was pretty heartbreaking for him. Let's see. Oh, this is just another sample of some of him with his pictures, with his daughters and his wife. And you can look at that one on your own time. In this picture, you're going to, let's see, it says, look at that beautiful ranchero. What would it be like to live during those times? What are some of the feelings you have upon looking at that home? For me, I can only imagine the peace and the good weather, knowing that it was in California. It's got to be gorgeous weather. It would be hard to feel peace during all of the conflict that was starting to happen in the country at that time. I would be scared to own something as large as that ranch and know that it could be taken at any time. Let's see here. Another interesting side note, from 1881 to 1900, now we're talking about a Cuban epidemiologist. His name is Carlos Juan Finlay. He solved the mystery of what caused yellow fever. This deadly disease had known no cure for over 100 years and had killed thousands of people. In 1881, he discovered that mosquitoes spread yellow fever, but he couldn't prove it. Other scientists did not believe him and made fun of him, calling him the Mosquito Man. Eventually, because of his work, that Finley and Walter Reed, another important physician, they were able to develop a vaccine and finally cure yellow fever. So it's kind of interesting. Strike breakers and the agricultural. In 1912, thousands of Mexicans, most of them single men, got off the train, and this is kind of talking about some of the Mexicans that actually came into Utah. This was back in 1912. A lot of them single would come off the trains and just replace all the workers that were striking, that were the miners. But they were striking because they didn't feel like they could get equal pay or good pay, bad working conditions. And so these Mexicans came in off the train and decided, you know what, we're going to take up the work for these striking workers. So do you think that would make them liked by a lot of the locals? Actually not, because here they are trying to strike. The local Utahns were trying to strike, and then we have the Mexicans. They're saying, well, we'll work for lower wages. Finally, when they did go back to work, the Mexicans were, of course, kicked out of the jobs and treated poorly. A lot of them ended up going back to California or back to Nevada, or back to Mexico and Texas. So, a lot of them would kind of take care of the sugar beets, and that was a really back-breaking job. You're out there in the dead heat of the summer and working 12 to 13, 14 hours a day, and then doing it all over again. So it wasn't the best job, but at the same time, it was some of the only jobs at that point. There was a large number of Latino immigrants that worked on the railroad, and a lot of our railroads are built by the Mexicans or the Latinos. Men called tocaros worked in crews that repaired the rail lines and helped with their upkeep. Some of their families lived in old rail cars that weren't being used anymore, next to or near the tracks. In Utah during the 1920s and 30s, Utah had to set up their hiring and firing policies based on who was in the state at the time. So whoever was in the state first got the best jobs. If you came in later, then you got the poorest jobs. It really wasn't too fair, but at the same time, that was all they had set up at the time. So here's the Puerto Ricans. The onset of World War II disrupted many Latino families in Utah. The Army and Navy drafted husbands and brothers. In response, some Latinos and their daughters moved to Salt Lake City looking for jobs. That way they could support their families. With the shortage of men in the state, they ended up trying to recruit some workers from New York, and a lot of them were the Puerto Ricans. They weren't accustomed to the working conditions in the mine, so it was kind of hard for them to work here. A few became leaders of the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the 70s. In 1967, there were no more than 10 Latino students in the University of Utah. The majority of them lacked financial support and worked as busboys in the sororities houses or as janitors, as ditch diggers. Mike Melendez, who was born in Bingham Canyon, later said that his parents only contributed $5 or $10 per month to his expenses. In spite of these barriers, he ended up graduating, and became one of the first minorities advisors at the University of Utah. As an advisor, he took a very special interest in recruiting Latinas. He believed education was very important to the women, in case something ever happened to their husbands, and it was a good example to pass on to the Latina women or family. Let's see here. The summary. This is just a small part of it, and I'll just talk about this before we get started with our video. This part of the summary is for me. I have learned more than I bargained for in doing this assignment. I could have added so many more pages about the wonderful and amazing Latino people. Researching about this culture has given me an insight that I needed in order to become a better multicultural teacher. I'm going to be able to take away from this project not just knowledge, but a new perspective on how many differences can be made into a positive. After all of the research I did, the main feelings I have were of sadness, that we as humans feel we have a right to take land, to take away voices, languages, heritage, and culture from certain people. You might notice that I had a little more information about Vallejo in my presentation, and that was on purpose. I had watched a video about him, and I couldn't help but feel the sadness he felt at being betrayed by people he thought were his allies. He had always considered himself a very hospitable person and could not imagine that anyone else would want to take from him or his family. He was a generous person who gave a lot to the community and the land that he loved. It never even entered his mind that the very people he was helping was the first to imprison him. Unfortunately, their story of heartache and betrayal was all too familiar. Throughout history, it seems, there are people who are the victors and people who are the victims. It is amazing that even today, we have so many trying to fight for the exact same rights that is entitled to all, not just some. And we'll go ahead and start the video now, and thank you.